Good afternoon and welcome to the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association's Summer 2018 Member Update webinar. I'm SM Leduc, Manager of Research and Policy at CHRA, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I will give a brief overview of the webinar technology. I will then introduce our agenda and speaker for this afternoon's presentation. Today's webinar is in real time. You should now be able to see a title screen of today's presentation and be able to hear me via your computer speakers, headset, or through your telephone if you have chosen to dial in. You are all currently muted. We do this to minimize background noise. However, if you wish to ask questions, which we encourage you do, you may type your question into the question dialog box on the webinar control panel at any time during the presentation. We will address as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. If at any point you are having problems with the technology, send a message in the chat box in the webinar control panel. Today's webinar is an opportunity for CHRA to provide you with an update on what we have been up to over the past few months and what is coming up. It is also an opportunity for you as CHRA members to ask us questions. I now have the pleasure of introducing you to CHRA's Executive Director, Jeff Morrison. Before joining CHRA, Jeff worked in a number of other national associations, including Director of Government Relations and Public Affairs with the Canadian Pharmacists Association, President of the Association of Canadian Engineering Companies, and Director of Government Relations and Director of Environment for the Canadian Construction Association. Jeff has also worked for the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada and several members of Parliament in the 1990s. Jeff is also very active in the Ottawa community, currently sitting on the Board of Directors of Operation Come Home and Away Home Canada, chairs the National Capital Pride Run Organizing Committee, and previously served as President of the Board of Directors of the Centretown Community Health Centre and a board member of Bruce House. Welcome, Jeff. I will now turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, SM, and thank you all for taking the time on a midsummer day to be joining this webinar. I first also want to extend our deepest apologies to any of you on the line who happen to be either British or Croatian. When we scheduled this, we didn't realize that there would be a World Cup semi-final starting in about half an hour. So if we suddenly see a bunch of people leave the call in about 30 minutes, then we'll know we had a couple Brits or Croatians on the line here today. Hope your summers are all going well. It's been very hot and dry here in eastern Canada, so I don't think, other than the farmers, I don't think anyone's been complaining too much. Really, the purpose of today, as SM just explained, is really twofold. First, we wanted to provide you, our members, with an overview of some of the major activities and initiatives that CHRA has been involved with over the past 6 months or so, with a particular focus on also how that is interacting with what's happening on the broader national scale, and in particular with respect to the National Housing Strategy. And then secondly, we wanted to really flip it around and then look forward and provide you with a bit of a heads up and an indication of major activities and initiatives over the next 6 months leading to the end of the year. And then end it off with a chance for you to ask any questions about what your national association has been up to. So let me just first start here. Oh, sorry, I'm just having a technical, oops, there we go. Sorry. So let me just first, as I mentioned, outline a few of the major key milestones that we have been up to for the start of this year. And really, I think it goes without saying that the major key milestone and initiative that we've been involved with has been the National Housing Strategy, which was first fully unveiled in November of 2017. Now we've sent out a lot of information, we've held webinars, sent out newsletters, etc., on the various initiatives on the National Housing Strategy. And so I hope that folks have been taking a bit of time to become more familiar with all those components. It's a fairly complex strategy. I've been using the analogy of a toolkit, and in any toolkit there's a number of different tools. Someone the other day used the analogy of a quiver with a number of arrows in it. Whichever analogy you choose to use, the reality is that the National Housing Strategy does have a number of components, and as your national association, part of CHRA's job is really to be on top of all of those developments and to influence and advocate for their implementation as they get rolled out. So thus far in 2018, given that the strategy was just unveiled in November of 2017, there's a lot of pieces, a lot of tools that are still to be unveiled. But thus far in the year, we've seen really 3 buckets of tools that have been, in fact, unveiled. Those have included the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, the Federal Community Housing Initiative, and the various research measures. I just want to take a bit of time to discuss the first 2 of those tools because there's been a fair amount of discussion and questions asked about those. First, on the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, just a reminder, this is the $16 billion fund that provides funding for affordable housing providers for repair, renewals, and new construction. Essentially, this is the biggest piece of the puzzle for bricks and mortar type projects. This fund was just announced or was unveiled with all the various application criteria about 2 months ago. And I will just say that since it was first unveiled, CHRA has heard a lot of concern, a lot of comments regarding the application process that CMHC put in place. We've been collecting those concerns, and they are all valid. Just as some examples of those various concerns, the application process itself is extremely lengthy. The initial application is about 200 questions. We've heard that some of the eligibility criteria doesn't apply to every project. So, for example, the co-investment fund criteria includes the necessity to have energy efficiency and accessibility conditions in every project, when in fact not every project will involve either of those conditions. There's been some other things, such as, for example, a minimum 5-unit requirement to access the fund. Not all affordable housing entails 5 units. There's been concern over the lack of information and guidance and clarity on various items, such as the form of municipal or provincial contributions that the fund mandates. So there's a whole series of problems with the application process, and I can tell you we have met with CMHC just last week. In fact, tomorrow morning I'm having a call with Adam Vaughan, the Parliamentary Secretary, to discuss these concerns. The feedback we've received is that yes, they understand that these are valid concerns, and that from CMHC's standpoint, the initial application process was put together in a rather quick fashion. They understood that there were problems. They will be fixing these problems, although we don't yet have a time frame as to when the revamped application process and procedures and guidelines will be put in place. So for any of you who have been applying for this and are finding it frustrating, there are changes coming. So you may want to wait, and I'm just trying to find, or we're trying to find out more information on when those changes are coming. On the Federal Community Housing Initiative, again, as a reminder, this is the program that essentially provides a 10-year extension for operating agreement holders whose operating agreements expire between 2016 and 2027. This program will provide an extension of those subsidies up until 2027. This is a program that's essentially been divided into 2. For anyone with a provincially administered operating agreement, which is the bulk of you, you probably haven't heard anything yet about what is happening or the state of your extension. That's because in the NHS, the federal government did put forth money to help extend those subsidies for the coming 10 years. But because they were provincially held operating agreements, the feds essentially required the provinces or territories to cost match the federal funds. Now, anything involving a provincial cost match program has probably not been announced as of yet, because those require essentially federal-provincial bilateral agreements to be signed. And as of today, there are only 3 agreements that have been signed, and those have just been signed fairly recently. So there's still a bit of time required to figure out the details around that. So if you have a provincially held operating agreement and you haven't heard anything about the extension, I would say don't worry, it's coming, but we just need to get those bilats signed, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. If, however, you have a federal administered operating agreement, you should have by now already received confirmation of at least a short-term extension of your operating agreement if it did expire between 2016 or will be expiring up until 2020. What they have called the first phase of extensions under federal operating agreements did allow for essentially extending to 2020, which is what they call phase 1. Phase 2 is still to be determined. That is for federal operating agreements that will expire any federal operating agreements that are expiring between 2016 and 2027. The second phase of the federal contribution, which would be from 2020 to 2027, is being really figured out this summer. In fact, literally as we speak today, there's a meeting at CMHC with various stakeholders, including CHRA, to start the discussion on what that phase 2 approach would look like. So we have nothing yet to announce on that. CHRA will be very actively working with CMHC and other stakeholders to design that second part of the federally administered operating agreement component, but we're still a ways away from that yet. So we'll of course be communicating that information out to members as it becomes available. So I did want to spend a bit of time on those two components because there have been a number of questions and a bit of uncertainty as to where those two stand. The third piece that has been announced, the research and innovation measures, perhaps less controversial. There's a number of programs that have been announced vis-a-vis research, and those can all be found on the CMHC website. Applications for those are all now being accepted. So in terms of our actions as an association, again, we've been communicating, we've been influencing the administration and the implementation of those programs, and we'll continue to share information as it becomes available. As you can imagine, with so many various pieces or tools in the toolkit, it's a challenge to sort of keep on top of all these programs and communicate information, but we'll continue to do that. Let me just turn now to a few of the other components or the tools in the NHS toolkit. There's been quite a bit of discussion, especially in the media over the past few weeks, on the right to housing legislation that was contained in the NHS. As many of you know, CMHC launched a consultation period on that legislation that lasted from March until just a few weeks ago at the end of June. Those consultations involved face-to-face meetings as well as written responses, and CHRA was very active in all of those consultations. We also, as an association, produced our own written response, and if you haven't yet seen it, it is available on our website. Now, in terms of next steps, we're expecting, frankly, within a week or so, we would imagine, that the federal government will issue a summary of those consultations, a so-called What We Heard report. And then we were expecting by the fall that legislation would actually be tabled in the House. From that point on, CHRA, as well as our stakeholder partners, will be very active in that parliamentary process to ensure that the legislation is passed before the next federal election. Now, some of the media that's been out there over the past few weeks has really focused on some concerns that some stakeholders, including the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Housing, have had with the legislation and whether it would in fact contain all the details and contain all the commitments that were mentioned in the NHS. I know that there has been some of these concerns. I personally have not seen them. We've had a number of meetings with CMHC. As I mentioned, we'll be chatting with Adam Vaughan tomorrow. And at this point in time, I'm not convinced that there are significant differences from what was initially announced in the NHS with this legislation. Time will tell, and we will, of course, be communicating with our counterparts in the federal government. But at this time, I don't think there's any cause for panic that, in fact, the progressive right to housing will not be implemented. But we'll see, and we'll continue to have those discussions. But I think that in the fall, you can reasonably expect that legislation will, in fact, be tabled. So moving on, I mentioned the importance of those bilateral agreements between the federal government and provincial and territorial governments. And those are key because, again, within the NHS toolkit, a number of the measures that were contained therein require federal provincial cost matching. The community initiative that I mentioned earlier, which essentially extends operating agreement subsidies, is one example. The much talked about portable housing benefit is another example. So without these bilateral agreements, these cost matching programs simply can't move forward. However, the good news is that in April, there was at first a multilateral agreement that was signed by all FPT governments, with the exception of Quebec, that essentially said that everyone would work towards the development of an NHS, even on those measures requiring provincial or territorial cost matching. And since that time, we've now seen 3 bilateral agreements signed in Ontario, BC, and just a couple days ago in New Brunswick. And we expect that by, it's hard to say, but probably by the end of the fall, we should see most, if not all, of the other provinces and territories sign off. By the way, there's been a website that CMHC has created where you can now download these bilateral agreements. CHRA will be in our newsletter, which I believe is going out today. We'll be providing a link to that website, so you can actually see all of these bilateral agreements for yourself. There has been, I should add, there has been a question raised with respect to Ontario, and given that the Ontario bilateral was signed prior to the election there, and now, of course, we've seen a new government elected, there's been a question as to whether that bilateral is in any danger. The short answer is we, of course, don't know yet. If I was to place bets, I would assume no, that in fact the bilateral agreement should be respected, but a new government can be unpredictable and one never knows. But at this point, I don't think there's been any signs that the Ontario agreement is in risk of being ripped out. Of all the pieces I mentioned in the National Housing Strategy, of all the tools, there remains one that is in our opinion, very much outstanding and that has not yet been included, and that is an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous component, or an Indigenous housing strategy. As many of you know, CHRA has long fought for, really since the beginning of the NHS consultation, we've fought for the inclusion of a distinct urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. There was in the in the 2018 federal budget, there was money allocated for what they have called 3 distinctions-based Indigenous housing strategies. These are housing strategies for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And each of those strategies is currently being developed in partnership with the 3 organizations representing those 3 Indigenous groups. However, our call is for a 4th housing strategy, that being for the urban and rural Indigenous population, especially important given that that is where the majority of Indigenous people in Canada actually live, is in an urban-rural setting. So as of late, there have been a number of efforts in this area. There has been a new policy paper that really, I think, expands on the expands on the previous policy papers that we've issued, that goes into more depth and provides more vision and content for what an urban and rural and northern Indigenous strategy could look like. That's based on a principle called FIBI, which our Indigenous our Indigenous Caucus Working Group has coined. FIBI, which stands for Indigenous, by Indigenous, really embraces the principle that any Indigenous housing strategy has to be led, governed, and created by Indigenous peoples themselves. That paper, by the way, is available on our website for download. We've had a number of meetings with both CMHC and the new Department of Indigenous Services to call for this 4th stream and to talk about what the content of that would look like. And I should add that we're expecting next week a meeting with Minister Philpott, who looks after the Department of Indigenous Services, to have that high-level discussion. And at our AGM in April, our members passed a very strongly worded resolution supporting that 4th stream. And I should add that we're seeking out endorsements of that resolution right now. So if your organization has not yet endorsed and would be so willing to do so, you can obtain that resolution from our website, and we'd really strongly encourage you to send in your endorsement of it to SM Leduc, and her contact information is on our website. So we'd really encourage you that. I think the more voices we can have supporting that concept of an urban and rural Indigenous housing strategy, the better. One last piece I wanted to talk about, and although a relatively small tool in the toolkit, it's one that's taken up a bit of our time because this was something that CHRA has been calling for several years, and that is the creation of a technical resource center. We know that if the overall objective of many social housing providers is to transform their operations, to create a new model that doesn't necessarily involve a continuing operating agreement model, that many of them, especially smaller housing providers, will need help in order to do that. And that help could be in the form of technical assistance and or possibly some grants to hire, whether it's to hire legal folks or financial support or whatever, in order to help modernize or transform or change their models. So this concept of a technical resource center was included in the NHS. It was a tool in the toolkit. And just by way of an update, CMHC a couple of months ago issued a public RFP for organizations to bid on operating and running this technical resource center alongside what they have called a sector transformation fund, which would be, in fact, a granting program that would provide funding to housing providers to facilitate their transformation of their operating models. A number of organizations, housing-related organizations, including CHRA, the Co-op Housing Federation, and others, came together to bid on this initiative. And what we really envision is that this center would essentially use existing capacity that many provincial housing associations already have. It would build on that so that they could essentially offer greater service to members. They could have additional capacity to help members who wish to transform, and there would be a presence in those provinces and territories where, frankly, there is no service currently available already. And as I mentioned, that there would be grants available to facilitate the transformation of operating models. There's going to be, I think, very shortly an announcement on this center as to who will be operating it, when it will be starting, and so forth. So I don't have an announcement to make yet today, but I think you can expect something very shortly. And I should also add that as part of this, there will be an additional granting source called a tenant initiative. This will provide funding for essentially tenant associations who wish to have more of a say, who wish to engage more in housing policy overall. The details are still a little sketchy on this, but there will be something there for tenant groups. So that's essentially, I'm just going to go back a moment. So that's essentially a quick overview of some of the major developments that have happened with respect to the NHS. I'll talk when we look forward, I'll talk about a few others that we're expecting to come down the pipe. But I can say it's an extremely active file, and because we are still in the middle of implementing a number of these tools, it's something that I know will be taking up a lot of CHRA's time over the next few months, if not years. So let me now just turn to a few other services and initiatives that CHRA has been pursuing over the past few months. First, starting with our research and innovation functions. I was very proud that CHRA was able to partner with a number of other organizations led by the BC Nonprofit Housing Association in launching an updated rental housing index last May. For those of you who have not yet checked out this tool, it is a information-packed website on providing information on rental rates, capacity, income levels, etc., all on a municipal level. It's a fantastic tool, and I'd encourage you all to check it out. We've been looking at, we've been looking at census data from 2016, and we've been producing some infographics and other material that really highlights what some of that census data has shown. Under our international theme, we held during our conference a few months ago, we held an international forum in which representatives of Canada, the US, and the UK came together, and we compiled some of the recent housing-related developments in those countries into a paper, which is now available on our website. So if you're curious as to what's happening in the U.S. Or the UK, I'd encourage you to look at that paper. Given everything that's happening with the NHS, we've been starting to produce more blogs, articles, etc. about those various measures. And we've held a couple webinars this year. We talked a webinar about the Indigenous paper that I just referred to, a webinar on food security, and another on communication strategies. There'll be a number of additional webinars coming in the next few months, and I'll talk about that in a second. We held in April, as many of you know, we held what I think was a very successful Congress here in Ottawa. At over 550 delegates, it was, I believe, our second largest Congress ever. A number of keynote speakers, including Minister Duclos, well-known writer Andre Picard, Leilani, the UN Special Rapporteur, was there, and others. And really, the Congress this year was a celebration of our 50th anniversary, which, of course, 2018 is. But we also had a strong theme regarding our Indigenous messaging that we've been very focused on over the past couple of years. And for any of you who have not been to a CHRA Congress, the comment I hear over and over is that our Congresses, unlike perhaps some of the other conferences out there, are very high level. They're very strategic in nature, and that's really reflected in the type and the quality of our workshops and mobile tours that we offer. So again, if you've never been to a Congress, I'd really encourage you to consider a future one if you're really looking for some of that high level thinking regarding affordable housing. Another program that was launched really in 2017, but that really kind of came into its own in 2018 thus far, was our Housing Professionals Mentorship Program. This is a program that we launched with CIH Canada and Housing Partnerships Canada, thanks to a very generous grant from the Catherine Donnelly Foundation, and we want to thank them for that. This was the first year of this national mentorship program, and this was really a pilot year. We wanted to learn what worked, what didn't work, and what could be improved upon. And so in order to do that, we paired up. Essentially, we created 27 pairs across the country, so 27 mentors, 27 mentees who got together throughout the year and who were provided with a number of learning opportunities throughout the year. So really, the objective of this program is to help strengthen especially the new generation of housing leaders in Canada. And I think with some of these initiatives that we took under the program, that we were successful in that. We're currently about to evaluate the first year of the program, given it was a pilot, and we're expecting a new intake of applications to go out this fall. So if any of you are interested in becoming a mentee or mentor, or may know of someone, may have a colleague that you think would benefit from this, I'd strongly encourage you to send in an application this fall. This is a new item. One of the things that CHRA often hears, and I think some of our provincial counterpart associations hear, is that with so many different housing organizations, that there would be some benefit and value to providing a forum whereby messages could be aligned, where activities could be coordinated within the nonprofit housing sector. And so I'm very pleased to say that in about 2 weeks' time, this is a heads up, but in about 2 weeks' time, we'll be announcing the creation of a new alliance, which we're calling CANFA, the Canadian Alliance of Nonprofit Housing Associations. This alliance will be incorporating CHRA as well as almost all of the provincial nonprofit housing associations out there. So Manitoba Nonprofit Housing Association, BC Nonprofit Housing Association, and so forth. And really, this alliance, there's a number of purposes. It will aim to serve as a forum whereby issues of interest to the nonprofit housing sector can be discussed, and where activities, responses, and advocacy can take place in a more coordinated and aligned fashion. We'll be able to pursue research, share best practices and resources so as to provide some efficiencies within the nonprofit sector. And we'll be meeting bi-monthly, including at least one face-to-face meeting so again, that work can get underway. There will be no fees to join. This is really more at the association level to better coordinate and to provide some efficiencies within the nonprofit housing environment. So watch for that, quote, formal announcement in about 2 weeks, but we're excited about what the opportunities for this CANFA group can bring. So that was a quick overview of what's been happening at CHRA and nationally for 2018. Let me now just kind of turn my attention forward and talk about what we see on the horizon for the next few months. So first of all, in terms of our advocacy efforts, it goes without question that the creation of that additional tool within the National Housing Strategy, that being the development of an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous strategy, will remain a top priority. The right to housing legislation, as I talked about, will be introduced this fall and will therefore be going through the regular parliamentary process, and we will be there to share our thoughts and views on that legislation. As I mentioned, the Technical Resource Center and Sector Transformation Fund that will provide both technical support as well as financial support for housing providers who wish to transform their operations, that will be set up over the next few months. And again, more information and an announcement on that should be coming very soon. CHRA wants to work with CMHC and the federal government to make sure that you as housing providers have the information you need about forthcoming and current NHS programs. There are some significant funding programs to be accessed. We want to make sure that you have the information and the tools you need in order to do just that. So we'll continue to be communicating that out. I'm also proud to announce that CHRA will once again be hosting a Housing on the Hill Day, which in 2018 will take place on October the 23rd. Housing on the Hill, for anyone who has not attended this, is a one-day event in Ottawa whereby providers can come together, meet one-on-one or in groups with members of Parliament to talk about issues of concern to our sector, to share recommendations, and also to hear from the MPs themselves in terms of where some of their priorities lie. The day also provides folks with an opportunity to hear directly from politicians and from other key officials on recent developments. This year, I think goes without saying, we'll want some updates on the NHS measures. So watch for registration on that, which should be coming in the next couple weeks. It's really I think a day to help make your impact on federal policy. So again, I'd encourage you to consider that. And you know, the reality is we're now just over a year away from the next federal election, which we expect in the fall of 2019. We have now already begun looking at both our messaging for the election as well as our tactical efforts relating to the election. For those of you who were around in 2015, you'll recall that CHRA had a very robust election-related series of initiatives. One could argue that had a major impact in the NHS that we're now realizing. And so we want to continue that momentum by building on those efforts and really having a strong voice in the 2019 election. I can assure you that the tactics that we'll be looking to implement will have a very strong grassroots component. We want everyone to be participating in the election and to have your voice heard, and we hope to facilitate that. So stay tuned. There'll be more information coming, but that work is going to be a major focus for us this summer. On the research and innovation side, we are currently doing a comparative analysis of provincial and territorial housing budgets, and we hope to have that released soon so that we can see from province to province exactly what governments are doing with respect to affordable housing in their budgets. Thanks to a generous grant from BC Housing, we'll soon be releasing at least 4 research papers coming out of various sessions from our 2018 Congress, and those touch on a number of issues, and you'll see those once they're released shortly. As I talked about, we'll be soon releasing additional op-eds, articles, etc., explaining the importance of the NHS. Although there's still some confusion even within the housing sector as to what the NHS is, there's probably even more confusion and there's a lack of understanding about why we needed an NHS focused on social housing. amongst Canadians at large. And so we want to really provide some explanation to people as to why this is important and what needs to be done. As I said, the new CHRA group that will be announced shortly, we're hoping will become more of a centralized point of contact for the nonprofit housing sector. And as one of the initiatives that we'll be looking to undertake is working with federal, provincial, and territorial governments to simplify data collection. We know that all provinces and territories collect housing-related data differently and in sometimes a very labor-intensive way. We're hoping to work together to try and simplify and standardize that process. And one of the ideas that our Indigenous caucus has talked about is a paper linking housing and the role of housing to the overall reconciliation process, and really what role can housing providers play in fostering reconciliation. This is still being talked about, but we're hoping over the next few months that this is a project we can pursue. And we have at least 2 more webinars planned, most likely more, but the 2 that we have planned, one is an overview of that Canadian Rental Housing Index that I spoke of. That will happen in September and will be again led by the BC Nonprofit Housing Association. And then in October, we've been pleased to confirm Jesse Thistle, who, as many of you know, has done a lot of work in defining Indigenous homelessness, and he'll be presenting on his work. We had hoped to have him in the spring, but he's had a very busy schedule, so we weren't able to get him until October. I talked about Congress, and I can confirm that the dates for our next Congress are April 2nd to 4th, taking place in Victoria at the Victoria Convention Center. There's already been 1 meeting of the organizing committee, so work is well underway. We've had a number of questions asked as to when the call for proposals for various papers or sessions will come out. We expect that will be issued next month in August. So for those of you who have great ideas for papers or sessions, watch for that. And because the conference is a bit earlier this year, or excuse me, in 2019, we expect registration will open before the end of 2018. And we are planning to work very closely with the BC Nonprofit Association to partner with them and, in fact, look for some synergies with some of their efforts. We also often get asked, where are you going after that? So our board of directors has approved, in terms of locations, has approved the next 3 years beyond 2019. So in 2020, we'll be on the prairies in Saskatoon, in 21 in St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador, and in 2022 in Quebec City. A few other just very quick things. As I already talked about, this fall, our mentorship program will be issuing a new call for applications. So again, if any of you are interested or may know of folks, we'd encourage you to sign up. Under our international efforts, many years ago, there was an annual meeting called a tripartite meeting or a tri-country conference, whereby representatives from Canada, the US, and the UK would get together to share best practices and information on housing developments. There is now a very strong effort being led by our counterparts in the US and involving CHRA to bring back that conference. And we're aiming tentatively for the fall of 2019 as a first go-around. But unlike the previous conferences, we're hoping to really expand the number of countries so that there would be a broader representation. So that work is now underway. CHRA is working closely with our friends at the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada to plan some activities regarding or on National Housing Day on November 21st, so stay tuned. CHRA is also in discussions with some external providers to create some new affinity programs. By the way, some of you may not be aware that CHRA has a number of affinity programs. Those are available, more information about those is available on our website. But there will be some more coming and hope to be able to launch this fall. And just a reminder that this is our 50th anniversary in 2018. So we're going to continue to celebrate that, whether that's by sharing some old magazine covers on our Twitter page, whether that will be a celebration on National Housing Day. Those efforts will continue. And we would hope that all of you as members we'll take the time to really celebrate and acknowledge CHRA's role over the past 50 years. We have on our website a 50th anniversary video that we produced for Congress. Take a few moments to check it out. It's just a good summary of CHRA's presence for 50 years, and that's something I think hopefully we can all be proud of. So I'm going to leave it there and provide just again our contact information. But again, I want to say that none of this is possible. None of the successes that we've enjoyed would be possible were it not for you, our members. So I want to thank you for continuing trust in us, your membership in us. We hope that you're seeing the results and the impact of some of our efforts, particularly at the national level. And I can assure you that those efforts are certainly not going to stop anytime soon. So with that, again, thank you, and I'll now turn it over for questions.
So for those who have questions, and if you haven't already done so, you can type them in the dialog box on your control panel. So there is both the questions and the chat function where you can insert your questions. So we've already addressed a few throughout the presentation, and I don't currently see any. So I suppose, Jeff, do you have any last words before we sign off?
So the only thing, if there are no questions, I guess that's a sign that we've addressed most of them. So that's, I suppose, a good thing. Again, I just would encourage you all to check out our newsletters in particular. As I've really made the point throughout this presentation, there's a lot going on right now. There's a lot that folks, hopefully are keeping up to date with, especially those measures in the NHS, but even some of our research and other initiatives. So I'd encourage you to check out our newsletters, our social media feeds to keep abreast of all those initiatives. These programs that we're lobbying for are for you. They're intended to help you with your day-to-day operations, with your models, with your buildings. So we want to make sure that you have access to these programs. If you don't know about them, then there's no point. So I'd really encourage you to stay up to speed. And at any time, please do not hesitate to reach out to either myself, another member of our team, our board members who are across the country. They're often a great point of contact, not just to share your questions, but also any concerns. I'm here, we're here in Ottawa, and that's nice, but we can't really get a sense of what's happening around the country unless we hear about it from you folks. So we're really hoping that this is a two-way communication, that our members won't hesitate to reach out to us if there's questions or concerns. So again, with that, I just want to say thank you. And SM, is there any other questions that have come up?
No, it looks like you've covered all the bases. So that would be all the time that we have for today's webinar. So many thanks to all of us, to our audience for participating. Today's webinar recording will be shared with all CHRA members in the coming days. So thank you, enjoy your summer, and bye for now.